Welcome to War Room, the official podcast of the U.S. Army War College online journal, graciously supported by the Army War College Foundation. Please join the conversation at warroom.armywarcollege.edu. We hope you enjoy the program.
Make sure not to miss a single episode and subscribe to A Better Peace, the War Room podcast, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. The views expressed in this presentation are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect those of the U.S. Army War College, U.S. Army, or Department of Defense.
Welcome to A Better Peace, the War Room podcast. I'm Ron Granieri, professor of history in the Department of National Security and Strategy at the U.S. Army War College and podcast editor of the War Room. It's a pleasure to have you with us. For more than 50 years, the U.S. Army War College's Eisenhower Series College Program, or ESCP, has been designed to encourage dialogue on national security and other policy issues between War College students and the broader public. In pursuit of dialogue, students in the program travel across the country, speaking to college classes, voluntary organizations, think tanks, and other public forums. Here at A Better Peace, we hope to give our listeners a sense of what ESCP students present by giving Eisenhower program participants a chance to share their expertise and insights by offering short versions of their Eisenhower speeches and discussing their personal experiences with the program and at the Army War College in general. Today's podcast is one of a pair of Eisenhower podcasts for the class of 2025. Our topic in today's podcast is China and the United States' relationship to China, very broadly conceived. Numerous official documents over the past 5 years or longer have signaled that the United States has adjusted its strategic focus away from the global war on terrorism to one of great power competition, which means dealing primarily with the challenges offered by China and Russia. Such a shift has been welcomed by those tired of the frustrations of the so-called forever wars, but the long-term implications of such a renewed focus remain open to debate. China, in particular, poses a historically difficult challenge as strategic competition interacts with the many financial and trade connections between two of the world's biggest economies. Our three guests today, members of the Army War College class of 2025 and the ESCP, will draw on their experiences to help us better understand China's current global activities and their impact on American policy. Our three guests, Lieutenant Colonel Christiana Crawford, Colonel Jody Daigle, and Colonel Amanda Raney. Lieutenant Colonel Christiana Crawford is a U.S. Marine Corps Reserve Operational Planner and Western Europe Foreign Area Officer. Commissioned in 2004 from the U.S. Naval Academy, she recently served as the lead planner for Marine Corps force modernization efforts in the Pacific. She holds a Doctor of Chiropractic and master's degrees in international relations and defense studies. Colonel Jody Daigle, a West Point graduate, has served in infantry and special forces roles with deployments to Iraq and the southern Philippines. His Indo-Pacific focus includes military capability development and diplomatic service at U.S. embassies in India, China, and the Philippines, advancing regional security cooperation and joint operational coordination. Colonel Amanda Raney is a medical operations planner in the Washington Army National Guard. She specializes in planning medical support for combat forces and leading medical units. Most recently, she commanded a multifunctional logistics battalion. In her civilian career, Colonel Raney manages clinical trials developing new cancer medicines. We have three very accomplished students from the War College with us today, and we look forward to hearing each of them give a little insight into what they've done in the Eisenhower program, and then we will have a conversation. Christiana, I'm going to start with you.
Well, perfect. Thank you so much for having us today. So I wanted to start with a little bit of a story. So like many families in the United States, I sort of dread Thanksgiving because I have a relative who likes to tell me, my brother-in-law, that war is caused by militaries. And if we did not have militaries, we would not have war or conflict. So we should not have militaries and I shouldn't have a job. And this is always very frustrating until I came to the War College and the perspective was a little bit different. And that is, when you arrive at the War College, they tell you about the founder and the purpose of the War College. And it's not to promote war, but to preserve peace. So it's a very interesting way of looking at it. And that's exactly the goal behind U.S. military strategy. The idea of building a strong military so we never have to use it. But there's a balance here, especially when it comes to China. The U.S. isn't about seeking war. We're prepared to fight, but we don't want to have to fight. And our goal is peace and stability and prosperity, protecting United States interests. But we know that peace requires strength. And sometimes that peace involves posturing and a balance, and the balance of showing just enough power to make aggression seem too costly, but at the same time, making sure that it doesn't invite escalation. So we want to make sure potential adversaries know that if they challenge us, that the cost will be too high to bear. So before coming to the War College for the past 4 years, I served as the lead planner in the Pacific, as you mentioned, doing force modernization, which was creating highly mobile and lethal forces capable of responding to any threat. And every day, I had to ask myself, are we getting that balance right between peace and provocation? And I asked myself, will this change China's calculus? Will this make China hesitate for even a moment? The goal wasn't defeating China. It's about deterrence, integrated deterrence, not just the Marine Corps, but the military. And not just the military, but the military as one tool in the United States toolkit. So how do we make sure that our adversaries are thinking twice before acting? So the balance we're trying to strike is between peace and provocation isn't easy. It's incredibly difficult. And as we're walking that line, we need to make sure that we ask ourselves a couple questions. And those are our efforts to deter conflict unintentionally increasing the risk of war? And as we continue to engage with China, how do we reconcile that military deterrence with other areas that we're working together in, like in medicine and in public health, which Amanda's going to talk about? There's a delicate balance between cooperation and competition, and that's something that we really need to strive to manage very carefully.
Great. Thank you, Christiana. Jody, I'm going to let you jump right in, and then eventually we'll pull discussion together on all three speeches. Go ahead.
All right, Ron. Thank you again for having us today. As Christiana pointed out, the U.S. military has a great deterrence effect. We're unmatched in our ability to wage conventional warfare, and we keep evolving. Currently in the process of a deliberate shift, and Ron, like you'd mentioned, from years focused on counterterrorism to now preparing for what we see as great power conflict. As a warfighter, I agree with Christiana that we want our military to be prepared, but never used, except as an absolute last resort. Because once war starts, the damage will be generational. That's why I've been thinking hard about what actually drives nations to war and talking about it when we visit college classes during the Eisenhower program. And the one thing I've discussed with the students out there is at the War College, we dive deep into an ancient historian named Thucydides and his account of the Peloponnesian War. That was a conflict that destroyed both Sparta and Athens over 2,000 years ago. So why would this ancient war matter today? Well, human nature doesn't change too much, and history repeats itself. Back then, neither Athens or Sparta wanted war, just like neither China or the U.S. wants war today. Yet throughout history, since the Peloponnesian War, hidden forces have pulled great powers into a series of devastating wars. And that's exactly what's at stake for us. Resisting the gravitational pull towards a deadly confrontation that our children and grandchildren will pay the price for. The takeaway for me is that Thucydides pointed to these three forces that compel a nation towards war. And those three forces are fear, honor, and interest. And when I look at the U.S.-China relationship today, it's worrying because I see all three drivers of armed conflict right now catching on fire.
I'm going to come back to this, right? Mentioning Thucydides always gets me excited. But before we get to that, Amanda.
Thanks so much. You mentioned earlier that I'm a member of the National Guard, and in that capacity, I serve in the Army part-time, and I also hold a full-time civilian career. In my civilian career, I developed cancer medicines by managing clinical trials in the pharmaceutical industry. My year at the War College has allowed me time to reflect on a tension that had been building in my mind between these two hats that I wear in the few years before coming to Carlisle. There's a sticky common thread between my two worlds of military and medicine development, and that thread is what we're talking about today, China. You see, Chinese researchers and patients are vital partners in developing novel medicine. I think back to a true career high point for me in my civilian career. It was the moment when my project team unblinded the results of a clinical trial we had worked on for years. And we discovered that our novel medicine worked. It extended the lives of women who had a vicious kind of metastatic breast cancer. Why does that matter to us in the War Room podcast? Because I recognize that kind of advancement would be hampered without partnerships in China. At the same time, I know that our most recent national military strategy says that China is our most consequential strategic competitor with the will and the means to pose an existential threat to our way of life. I have a much deeper understanding of that threat now after my studies here at the War College. So this tension had been developing before, essentially just depending on which hat I was wearing at the time, Army hat, civilian hat. And I've wrestled with it, and I've decided it's not a tension that can be resolved. It has to be managed. I also don't think this is just my personal thing to think about. The tension reverberates throughout our national discourse. Just think about hot topics in the news around TikTok, the CHIPS Act, tariffs. These are all evidences of ways that we are both trying to cooperate and compete with China at the same time. A lot of the students that we talk to are going to go into careers where they will interact with China. So my message to them was first to discuss my experiences from a business perspective in balancing the benefits and the risks of working with China. I challenged them then to think about how will they manage similar benefits and risks in their own industries, but not just for the good of the bottom line of the companies they will work for, also for national security. I hope that one day this tension between China as our partner and China as our pacing challenge will be peacefully resolved. But until then, I think we all have to manage the tension that's inherent in strategic competition.
That's great. Thank you, the three of you, for your presentations and for getting at this kind of these big questions. I want to get into talking about China, but also listening to your speeches, the perspectives that you were bringing, and also, I read your brief biographies, but it is notable, right, how different the three of you are. We have an officer in the Marine Corps, right, an officer in the Army, an officer in the National Guard, that each of you bring to the War College different perspectives, which I think that for the broader public to understand how we construct a class at the War College, you realize that we have people come from lots of different places. And I'm curious for each of you is how you have found, considering that in order to get here, you had to be really good in the world that you were a part of. And then we bring you here and we bring you together with all these other folks from all these other worlds. And how have you found that to be? Amanda, I want to start with you because I also want to ask, what was it like putting your civilian career on hold for a year to come to the War College?
Well, to answer your first question, for me, this has truly been a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Mm-hmm. I have not taken a lot of breaks from my civilian career in the past. This is really the first time since I left active duty after my initial service time that I stepped away for such an extended time to focus on my Army career. And doing that with such an accomplished group of colleagues who bring a really diverse views and perspectives, doing that with the international fellows that we have here, I feel has been very sharpening. They say iron sharpens iron, and I feel like that was just about every seminar discussion. I experienced that in the Eisenhower program, where we all helped each other to improve our public speaking skills and our messaging, and as well as our thinking. Mm-hmm. So it's been challenging and absolutely a privilege, I think, the experience of a lifetime for me.
Great. Yeah. Christiana, I want to turn to you, right? Marines are, of course, familiar with being surrounded and in advanced and exposed positions. And so what's it like being a Marine Corps officer at the Army War College?
It's actually been a really wonderful experience. The Marine Corps and the Army, you could say, have some inter-service rivalry. And And when I first heard I'm coming to the Army War College, this was not, in fact, my first choice.
Wow.
We're a sea service,
Sure.
so I was hoping to continue along with that. So Army was not my first choice, but with an open mind, came into it and realized just what a wonderful experience it was. So having that vast breadth and depth of different perspectives, whether it's a Special Forces officer like Jody or a National Guard member that has dual hats, it really broadened my perspective. And looking back, I wouldn't change it. I would say I would love to continue, have another year. I'd recommend it to anybody. And I'm actually quite glad that I did not get to go to the Naval War College for advanced studies.
Well, we're glad too, Christiana. Although I don't know how glad we were back in October or was in November when Army played Navy, but that's another story. So we'll save that. And Jody, for you as someone with particular experiences in Special Forces, right? So what's it like being here at the War College?
I think it's been phenomenal. Like the different backgrounds you'd mentioned from the beginning all coming together. It allowed me to learn a lot from my peers, and the teachers here are phenomenal. But I learned the most from our seminar discussions because we look at very complex problems, and based on our background, we see it in different ways from different angles, and we have different solutions to it. So I think that really helped me leave the War College and have a broader palette of not only ways of interpreting the complexities of the challenges, but also the different solutions we can apply.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And each of you in your presentations, you talked about how the relationship with China, and this is something I was thinking about in the opening statement as well, right? Our relationship with China is so complicated because we have all of these connections in addition to this very large, potentially catastrophic rivalry, right? In the sense there's always the danger of war, but the United States has had international rivals before. The United States has even had strategic threats before. I know we've never had a strategic threat that also was so completely imbricated with our economy and with so many aspects of our daily lives. And so this issue of striking proper balances or maintaining tensions. Each of you brought it up, but I want to dig a little deeper. So, Christiana, you studied international relations, so you know about the concept of the security dilemma, and the idea that what I do, which I think of as defensive to make me feel more secure, can be viewed by my counterparty as threatening. How well do you think the United States has been managing the security dilemma with the Chinese, and what do you think we should keep in mind as we try to do that?
I think, honestly, this is, we've had changes of administration, so everything is going to be a little bit different. But I think this is still very much a learning process. Mm-hmm. We do have a bit of a blueprint, if you will, from the Cold War, but as you mentioned, a very different competitor, different conflict. And so I think we're learning as we go and seeing, what that push-pull is, where we have an action, we see what happens, and then we learn from it and decide maybe that was too much, maybe that's not enough. We see that even currently, as an example with the use of tariffs. Mm-hmm. We made a move, had to see how it was going to play out, and then adjusted. Mm-hmm. So I think in this with China, there is a lot of that right now. Mm-hmm. And I think clear communication is absolutely critical, and clear communication not just in the openness to say, hey, we have lines of communication, but also in the U.S. showing what their goals are, messaging, so that there aren't any gotcha sort of moments of this is my action. If the U.S. messages that well, then there aren't any surprises.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, it makes a lot of sense, right? The idea of clear communication and regularizing that communication, right? You can't cut off altogether. Have you decided to bust out the Elihu Root line about not to promote war to preserve peace? You're going to use that at Thanksgiving this year with your brother-in-law?
I plan to use that at Thanksgiving. I'm not, and then I also just wanted a little plug for the Eisenhower speaking program in civil relations. Hopefully that will help me have that conversation at the dinner table and maybe get a little further than I have in the past.
That's right. I wish you luck with that. Right? That's a good thing to do. Well, and Amanda, you talk about in pharmaceuticals is a particularly fascinating and complex part of the U.S.-China relationship, right? A lot of pharmaceuticals are produced overseas, but also the idea of testing. I'm curious, before you came here in your work, has the political strategic relationship between China and the United States, have you noticed direct changes in the way that you're able to work with Chinese counterparties? And do you see that as is it getting harder essentially to work with the Chinese than it has in the past, or is it just a matter of walling off political disagreements?
Honestly, within my civilian work, that's not a topic that gets discussed. I think generally people are very sensitive to how important our partnerships are in China, and that's been very consistent. So there's certainly a concern to make sure we're viewing China always as a partner. I can't say that I've seen working with our Chinese partners become more difficult. But my role also would not have been one to advise on geopolitical risk when considering the overall business strategy. My role was to execute clinical trials. So it's quite possible those conversations are happening, just not that I was aware of.
I gotcha. All right, interesting. Good. Now, Jody, you one of the hats that I wear here at the War College is being course director for our course on theories of war and strategy, and of course the centerpiece of TWS is our discussion of the Peloponnesian War and Thucydides. And so it warms my cold, dark, shriveled black heart when somebody brings up Thucydides. The idea that states can not want to fight a war, but they end up fighting one anyway. We struggle with this because ultimately people make decisions, leaders make decisions. And so they sometimes talk themselves into believing that war is the only logical answer to a crisis. And so how should we try to understand, using the Thucydides example, but also how should we try to understand the way that leaders in the United States and in China imagine our relationship and how they are likely to respond to a crisis? If nobody expected that Corinth and Corcyra fighting over Epidamnus was going to lead to a war that was going to lead the Persians to control, or not the Persians, but eventually the Alexander and the Macedonians to control all of Greece. Nobody thinks that far ahead. Nobody imagines that. How do you think we are approaching this relationship with China now, and with an eye towards how we can handle crises better?
I think we're going down historical paths, and the way we can handle it better, I think, is just to be more aware of it, aware that there is a trap we can fall into. And I use the word trap because it's not only us at the War College that talks about Thucydides, but a little over 10 years ago, Graham Allison from Harvard Kennedy School, he wrote an article about the Thucydides trap. And it's 2,000-year-old conflict, but the team at Harvard looked at conflict over the past 500 years and saw, hey, in the 16 recent cases where a rising power challenged an established power, 75% of those ended up in conventional war. So I think that's something we need to be aware of, because while 75% end up in war, 25% don't. So we want to be on the 25% side. So it's being aware of those three drivers. I can give a breakdown of each of these drivers of conflict: fear, honor, and interest, and give brief observations on how they're working today. So the first one is fear, where fear drives a nation to fight when they think that conflict is inevitable for their survival. And the U.S. doesn't fear China as it is today, but it does fear what a more powerful China might do. Our national security strategy emphasizes this by calling China a competitor with the power to reshape the global order. And China builds on that fear too. Their leaders constantly evoke the fear of how the U.S. will ultimately contain and suppress them. So both sides have a real fear about that unknown future. And then the second is honor. And Thucydides used honor to mean national pride and credibility. And again, our national security strategy emphasizes that American leadership around the world is as critical as ever. And for the past 80 years after World War II, the U.S. and our Western allies have led the world, and we intend to maintain that leadership. And on China's side, President Xi frames China's resurgence as reversing their century of humiliation and restoring their rightful regional influence. So both nations are deeply invested in their sense of national honor and standing. And then finally, interest. It drives nations to pursue gain, potentially at others' expense. For U.S. policy, we've embraced a framework of strategic competition that we must outcompete China. And China responds by becoming more vocal about defending their core interests, a phrase they just started using a couple of decades ago, but have increased infrequently since. So these three drivers of armed conflict that Thucydides identified, the same forces behind every great power war in history, are really intensifying between the U.S. and China today.
Mm-hmm. And that's the challenge, right? Is that it's not going to go away, but we have to figure out how do we not go to war today, right? Christiana, you were talking about this, right? What deterrence means is if Xi Jinping wakes up every morning while he's shaving, decides is today the day that we decide to invade Taiwan, is every day he wakes up and decides, oh, maybe not today, is a win. But we run into the problem, and I was thinking about this, talking about the military and about deterrence. The highest example of this is with nuclear weapons, but in general, we talk about the always never paradox, right? Is that these weapons have to be always available, and you have to be always able to use them when you need to, but you hope that you will never have to use them. And so this is similar with building up the capacity to deter. And I think about this for the Marine Corps in particular in the Pacific, and you were involved in planning, right? Where do you put the Marines in a way that will deter the Chinese without making it look as though we are preparing for war?
Sure. I think where do you put the Marines? They're such a small force. And with force design and how the Marine Corps, this idea of it's a small mobile force, and that's part of the deterrent of the Marines could theoretically be on any island, anywhere, anytime, and be able to set up, shoot, identify targets, hold those targets at risk. And before China can react, essentially move again. So always changing that calculus of China. So just enough to not deter, but to make them ask, with this viable threat inside sort of the weapons engagement zone. So inside that home area of China, there is a viable threat there. Mm-hmm. And are they willing to do something with it? And how good is that threat or not? So it's a bit of a guessing game.
Yeah, it is a bit of a guessing game. And you don't want to overreact you don't want to put them in a position where they would overreact. That's right. Yeah. Well, and Amanda, I'm going back to the idea about how we work with the Chinese day to day and how we maintain those relationships that we talked about. When you were talking to students and when you were giving the speeches, what kind of approaches to China, what kind of questions and sort of attitudes were able to get from people who were asking you about relationships with the Chinese, right? What do you think the American public, based on these small examples, what do you think they see in this relationship and expect from this relationship now?
I think there's definitely a variety of views right now, and I think we probably spoke with people who hold the full variety of views. I would say the student audiences in particular, and we tended to speak with students who are studying political science or international relations related topics, were generally well informed mm-hmm. and highly engaged when we would talk about this tension between cooperation and competition with China. In one class that I attended, for example, the students were studying the South China Sea disputes, which I found fascinating. So they already had a pretty nuanced understanding of what could strategic competition look like at the ground level, or I suppose I should say at the sea level, in that region. Thank you for that. Their questions showed a desire, though, not just to understand the risks, but to explore, as you've said, how the U.S. can manage those without closing off opportunities for engagement. Students were definitely interested in what kinds of policy mechanisms could be effective to promote national security while also enabling cooperation. I got specific questions about tariffs, for example. I think the students want to find a productive but secure pathways to interact with China. One professor specifically commented to me that she appreciated hearing me talk about deterrence, and this is pretty relevant to what Christiana was just saying. I had explained that the military's goal is to prevent war, and the way she said her appreciation for deterrence signaled to me that she was looking for a reassurance about this, that the military's goal is not indeed provocation, but is deterrence to prevent the war. So I think civilian audiences want to know that, and they want to be reassured that that is truly the military's ultimate goal. I think we play a critical role as the military in deterrence, but I also believe that this cooperation, like I spoke about in developing medicine, when done responsibly, can also add to overall deterrence. It builds interdependence, it raises the cost of conflict, and it creates human-to-human connections between the U.S. and China. This message seemed to resonate with the students who have grown up in an era of true globalization and who wish to seek peace over provocation.
Oh, interesting. Well, and this makes me turn to you, Jody. In your work in community building and in establishing partnerships on the ground in places like the Philippines, right? How have you found both the way that students responded to the presentations, but also how it related to the work that you and your brothers and sisters in special operations deal with civil affairs and partnerships and cooperation in the region?
It brings up one of the talks that I had at UPenn, and one of the examples I started with was the concept of global security as a group project. Because anyone in school knows group projects are horrible. Like your teammates will always let you down in some way. But if worked correctly, these group projects could be phenomenal. It could be something that you never could have come up with on your own. It's kind of the greater of the sum of its parts. And I think that's where global security really relates to building alliances and partnerships. We can do so much more as a unified effort than we can individually. And I think that has a stabilizing effect. And we've seen the U.S. build an international system based on alliances since World War II, and that's kept us prosperous and safe, for 80 years. And I think we want to continue those efforts. And in the past 2 decades, I've been focused a lot on counterterrorism, and I think that the partnerships we built there are still viable to pivot towards other forms of security, and that could be adversarial actors as well.
Great. So we're just about approaching the end of our time, but I wanted to give each of you a chance to reflect on, is there one particular thought that you take away from your experiences within the Eisenhower program? Either what you learned from your classmates in the program or from any presentation that you gave or any audience that you heard. Christiana, I'm going to turn to you first.
Sure. The impression that I think I was really left with, and it leaves me in a good feeling, a good space, was that the country's in good hands. The engagement, the level of questions that were asked of us, the high level of thinking, it was really amazing to see. But also the not the pushback, but the questions, is this true? And then it really opened a dialogue. So it was a different experience. But in the end, I came away with, we're in good hands. These are hard problems, but we have a generation ready to step up and help solve them.
I like that. I like that kind of optimism. Amanda, how about you?
I have to agree. I found engaging with the undergraduate students to be very energizing. I was impressed by their depth of knowledge and their depth of interest, their open-mindedness. So it definitely renewed my faith in the younger generations who are coming up right now in school. I also had a renewed conviction of the importance of doing exactly those kinds of civil-military engagements. A lot of our audiences had quite a bit of familial relation to the military, a family member who had served, but also other audiences had almost no one who had any connection to the military at all. So I think it's a really important mission that the Eisenhower program has, but I would like to also see those kinds of efforts to engage with the civilian population of our country be carried on much more broadly than just within the Eisenhower program. I think it's something important for us as leaders to be considering as we move into our next roles. How can we have a positive impact on civil-military relations going forward?
Great. Thank you, Amanda. And Jody, take us home.
Yeah, and I very similarly, I'd love to offer you something different, but I think that the fact that we're all in the same message, it really means a lot, because the Eisenhower program was designed for us as military to go out and bridge that military-civilian divide. And I was preparing for that. But when we got out there, I realized that there's not much of a divide. Like, we are wrestling with the same questions and challenges that young people are today. And even on an age dynamic, I was thinking, what would me as a 22-year-old know about the world? And maybe I can educate my younger self. But when we got out there, they are hyper tuned in to the world around around us. So that gives me a lot of comfort in knowing that the next generation that's going to have to deal with these problems that we've been discussing today, we're really in good hands with them at the helm.
That's great. I mean, this is a very optimistic way to end it, and I like this, right? The idea is more engagement is better. The Eisenhower program was built in a period of deep civil-military disagreement, but now that it the 50 years that it exists is in part to help to bridge that gap, not to say that there is a civilian world and a military world, but to understand that we're in dialogue with each other. And here at the War College, right, the three of you with your different backgrounds, right, how we are also, even here within the military, if you will, are engaged in a dialogue where we each bring something different to that conversation. It's the kind of conversation we like to do at the Eisenhower program, we like to do at the War College, and we like to do here at A Better Peace. And so I want to thank Christiana Crawford, Jody Daigle, and Amanda Raney for joining us today on A Better Peace. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of you for listening in. Please send us your comments on this program and all the programs. Please send us your thoughts for future programs. We're always interested in hearing from you. Please consider being an ally, partner, cooperator, collaborator, with A Better Peace by subscribing to A Better Peace on your podcatcher of choice and taking a moment to rate and review this podcast, because that's the best way for other people to find out about us. We're always interested in growing this community for conversations like this one. And even though this conversation is over, we look forward to welcoming you all to the next one. And so until next time, from the War Room, I'm Ron Granieri.
And that concludes our program. Thank you for listening. The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or positions of the U.S. Army or the Department of Defense. Let us know what you think. Provide us your feedback, comments, or suggestions through our webpage at warroom.armywarcollege.edu. And have a great day.